When it comes to the role of parents in education, there's a distinctive difference between parents being in charge in theory and parents being autonomous in reality. Well, hello and welcome to part 2 of a 2-part series that we've entitled Restoring Parental Authority in Education. Today, Isaac and I are going to conclude our interview with Sheri Few, President and co-founder of United States Parents Involved in Education, or USPI. Now, in the end, the extent of a parent's autonomy or rights in reality is directly related to the operative worldview as defined by God and executed by parents, or as defined by those in positions in government and executed on government on behalf of parents. Now, for instance, the definition of parent is similar in 1829, Webster's dictionary. At that point, that dictionary reflected what I term a fear of God worldview. It was the dictionary that underpinned the meaning of words at the time of the founding of our country. That, and then the modern, I'm going to call no fear of God worldview definition as in dictionaries of today. For example, in 1829 and today in 2023, at the time of this program, parent is defined the same way. Here's the definition: a father or mother. Well, so is the word autonomy, which means the authority or right to self-government. Now, so far, so good. But when the purpose for parents is defined, here's where the difference in worldview becomes obvious. In 1829, the fear of God definition of parent included this statement: the duties of parents to their children are to maintain, protect, and educate them. Well, then when you consider the definition of duties or right, as in parents' rights to educate their children, here's where God's design is really flipped on its head, and government becomes hostile to God. The government of today becomes hostile to parents. Here's what it says. In 1829, the fear of God worldview definition of right was defined as conformity to the will of God. Get that? Right. Conformity to the will of God. Whereas in 2023, the no fear of God worldview definition is right is defined as a just claim or title, as in, and part of the definition, you have a right to say what you please. And herein you see is the problem. Under a biblical worldview and the original American fear of God worldview, parents' rights or autonomy in education was foundational and was recognized as the God-given right and duty for parents to educate their children in conformity to the will of God, the definition of right. So today, our government as God, they think they're God, has long been undermining the parent's role and has determined that they know best about what constitutes education for your children and mine. Since the early days of our nation, education was assumed to be Christian education. Parents, not government, held the autonomous right to make educational decisions for their children, and state and federal laws reflected God's model. For instance, in the first educational institution founded in America, the purpose for education that was posted on the walls, that institution was Harvard University. It was established to teach, of all things, men how to preach the gospel and to communicate a biblical worldview. The original purpose for education at Harvard still reads, "Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to know," get this, "to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, as found in John 17:3, which says this, and this is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent." Wow. So whether the issue is establishing the definition of human sexuality, or marriage, or role of parents, duty of citizens, or the purpose for government or business, or the solution is the same. Whether the issue is injustice, bribery, corruption, lawlessness, murder, envying, or strife, the solution is the same. Whether the issue is anxiety, despondency, or dependency, the answer is the same. Whether the question is, who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going? The answer is the same. And that solution and that answer is written in the Word of God. That alone informs us plainly of the plan of God, the will of God, and the ways of God. And with that introduction, more lengthy than normal, I know, I want to welcome in just briefly here back to the program, Sheri Few. Sheri, thank you so much for being back with us. And I'd like you to take just briefly, if you could, to get us going again on this program, restate the mission of USPI and why it's so important to you and for all people, for parents to understand they need to take charge of their children's education.
So thank you for having me back on. And the mission of United States Parents Involved in Education, or USPI, is to end the Federal Department of Education and all federal education mandates, because we understand that that's where the evil pedagogies originate. They're incentivized with federal dollars. So as an organization, we want to restore parental and local control of education. And it starts with the parents. So they absolutely have a responsibility to direct the education of their children. They need to be informed about what's being taught and make choices that are going to protect their children from things that are counter to their faith and God.
All right, excellent very much, and that sets us up just perfectly right now. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. We'll be back, and Isaac is going to engage Sheri with some further clarifying questions and interaction.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap. And last week we were also interviewing Sheri Few from USPI, and we were talking about what is going on that has kept parents from taking the responsibility of their children, their autonomy that God has given them, the Constitution has also given to them. And Sheri, in last week's interview, you were talking about schools, and we're talking primarily about government schools, but we could look at really any schools, but government schools. And the statement was made that they seem to be driving a wedge between the children and their parents. Now, I have friends who have their children in public schools, and some of them might scratch their heads and say, well, I don't see that happening. I'm very involved, I think, with my kids, and I know they're teachers. I have friends who teach in public schools, and they might say, oh, we never intend to do that. We would love to have parental involvement. But you have seen certain ideologies creeping in that you have identified are doing that. Could you maybe share with us one or two of the leading ideologies that are actually separating parents from their autonomy of their children and really kind of smothering out that Christ-centered, or at least a fear of God worldview?
Yes, so I'd say there are two that are most egregious. One is the teaching of critical Marxist theories. So what we've learned is that this has been their method, their pedagogy is to embed it throughout the curriculum at every grade level. So it's not a standard or a textbook that you'll see that says critical race theory on it. It's a pedagogy that teachers are trained to, as I said, embed across the curriculum at every grade level. So we know that in Marxism, there is no room for God, that the government becomes God. And so it's obviously counter to a biblical worldview. And so it's not just critical race theory. There are other critical Marxist theories. There's critical feminist theory, critical queer theory, and they're all put together in the umbrella of something called culturally relevant pedagogy. So this is how they're disguising the fact that they're teaching critical Marxist theories. The other really insidious problem is the sexuality education. And now with the emphasis on LGBTQIA+, the alphabet soup, they keep adding letters to that, but particularly grooming children into gender dysphoria, which is a mental health issue where children are taught to believe, or they're coerced into believing that they are something other than their biological gender. It is, and this is certainly an issue for parents as far as being separated from their children, because quite often we've learned that they are actually accessing medical care and treatment for these children through the government schools and intentionally not telling their parents and telling children to hide it from their parents. And they do it under the guise of protecting children, because somehow parents that won't accept their gender orientation would harm their children. And so it's just so upside down. It's crazy. And a lot of parents think, well, that's not happening in my school. But believe me, I have contacts all over the country. In the state where I live in South Carolina, that's supposed to be so conservative in the Bible Belt, it is right here in my own community. So it's everywhere. And those are probably the two worst ideologies that are harming children in the government schools.
Sheri, I so much appreciate your passion about trying to help children and helping parents learn, how to take control, to do what's best for their kids. And you said, though, that this goes beyond just parents. This goes to any conservative, God-fearing individual. And so there might be people watching and I'll say, well, I don't know if I need to understand all this. I don't have kids, or my kids aren't in school anymore. But this applies to all of us who are watching. And you used a term, awaken. You talked about, and I really appreciate just your openness and passion where you shared with us your own family story and your own child that went to public education and then walked away from the faith that your family has. And you talked about becoming awakened to what was going on, and that's a term that gets used for a lot of different things. But so basically, you say there are some folks who they're getting it. There's an awakening happening, maybe like in your case after something else has happened, and there's some who are seeing it ahead of time. What do you see as the difference between those who are awakening to it and seeing it, and those who haven't yet? Maybe you call them asleep or just haven't awoken yet.
Well, I guess that's the good news, if you will, because all of this is so depressing. I do like to talk about the bright spots. And the bright spot in this, and even the silver lining in COVID, if you will, was that parents were actually able to see what their children were learning because they were forced to be educated online at home. And so, because we don't even have textbooks in classrooms anymore, it's primarily online instruction. So parents were able to see what their children were learning. And that's why we've seen an awakening of parents. We've seen it all across the country. Parents are outraged. They're speaking out at their school boards. They're deemed domestic terrorists by the federal government because of their activity. So we see a battle going on, an actual battle between parents and the government. And so that is good news, because I've been involved for over 20 years in education policy. And people would see me as the tinfoil hat lady when I would talk about these things. But now parents get it. There are a large number of parents that get it. Many have withdrawn their children from government schools and are finding alternative methods. Many are homeschooling. The homeschooling alternative has really blossomed in recent years. There's lots of great social interaction for children and co-op learning. And there's even cottage schools where parents are getting together and paying for a teacher that will teach their children. So there's lots of great alternatives that are happening. But for those who are still asleep, I really pray that they will check out our documentary, Truth and Lies Film, that's the website, truthandliesfilm.us, but it's Truth and Lies in American Education. They need to see for themselves what's happening. They can contact our organization for support and resources so they can see more specifically what's happening in their school district. And, it's a shame if they're turning a blind eye to this, because I know they love their children. So I would just request that parents who are listening, that they would pray about this matter and see what God would show them.
Sam, you are a father, but a grandfather and a Christian, a person with a fear of God and a biblical worldview. But you're also a preacher, and you've been a lawmaker. You were in the U.S. or the Pennsylvania Assembly, and in that you weren't just in the Assembly, but you were actually in the committee. I don't know all the terminology, but you were one of the ones shaping the education policies for the state of Pennsylvania. What do you see? You and your wife Ruth Ann, you early on, felt the need to take your children out of school and to educate them at home. What do you see it will take to help people awaken to this idea and to help parents become aware of what their responsibility and how they can take autonomy of their children's education? Well,
Isaac, I think part of it goes back to what Sheri and we were talking about on part one, and I'm going to go back to her in just a minute and ask her to conclude on this, but that is the idea that we must understand that the problems that we are experiencing in American culture today, the heavy dependence on drugs, marriages falling apart, lawlessness in the streets, bribery in Washington, corruption at the highest level, all of these things which almost everyone is now coming to the point of saying something is really wrong, is the idea that it didn't happen by accident. And actually, what we are seeing in this country is the result of an inculcated worldview driven into and put into the minds of our children over the last generation or two. And we are now bearing the fruit. And what we are now seeing is the result of the seeds that have been planted a long time ago. And the only people and the only thing that can change that are the ones who God has said are primarily responsible for the education, and that is the parent. And with that, Sheri, I want to go back to you, because you've mentioned, there are problems. We know there are structural problems. The involvement of the federal government as an example, and the using of federal money to bribe the states to take over what is a constitutional right for the states to guide education. We know that there are techniques that have happened. There are reasons why there's Marxism being taught in the schools, because it's infiltrated our teaching schools, our teaching colleges. We know that our tests, our standardized tests, have been coordinated to Marxist principles, which guides then our education, and it's so subtle. It's subtle, but it has happened. So I just want to conclude with you here in this moment, Sheri, just ask you to say, and that is this. You are warning parents. We have warned parents. We have said freedom is not free. The fact that we've had a constitutional freedom and right to teach and right to worship in this country, we can see it's being taken away. So here's my question to conclude you the next about a minute and a half here in this segment. And from your perspective, what's at stake? What's at stake if parents do not, and I'm going to say yesterday, but not put it off, but if they don't get re-engaged now with their children's education, what's at stake if that doesn't happen?
Well, what's at stake for parents is losing their children. They will lose their children to an evil worldview. Their children could become involved with, some of this gender dysphoria and be recommended for, mutilation of their bodies. And they can get caught up in this. And, the government schools takes on the role of parent in this in those cases. And then the other thing that's at stake that, Isaac had asked me about, what about, people other than parents? And so often when I speak to groups, I tell them, even if you're not a parent, this issue is of grave concern, should be of grave concern to you. If you enjoy your freedom to worship, your freedom to make choices of all sorts. And as you alluded to earlier, we're already losing those freedoms. But if we don't stop the indoctrination of children in government schools, we are going to topple what is left of our freedom in this country. So everyone needs to be involved with this issue. They need to get engaged, go to our website, find out how they can get involved, and let's defeat the enemy, because it's definitely the enemy that we're fighting here.
Sheri Few, President, co-founder of USPI, thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to say goodbye to you right now. Thanks for being with us. God bless you. And stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to go to Isaac in just a moment and ask him to speak as a pastor, because the role of pastors in this process is bigger than you might think.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website, lighthousetv.org, for more information. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
All right, Isaac, I'm going to give you the final words here today. You are a millennial pastor. You and your wife, Jill, have made some difficult but very clear decisions with your children and how you are schooling them. But you also, pastor, you've had a church, you've communicated to other people. I want you to give a challenge right now, perhaps to parents your age, children, and to pastors in the pulpits about what they need to be doing right now to help answer the question I asked Sheri. What's at stake if parents don't reclaim their God-given right and duty to educate their children?
Well, Sam, you and I both love to study American history, and we can look throughout American history and see that awakenings have happened when pulpits have proclaimed the truth. And so it is, talk about God-given responsibilities. Pastors are given that responsibility to be an under-shepherd of the Lord, to tell people the truth. So whether it was the Revolutionary War or the Civil War or the freeing of slaves, churches have been a great part of these things, educating people, even teaching slaves, how to read, and so they could read the Bible and things so that they could become freed and see the movement and the Underground Railroad and Civil War and things. But we need an awakening right now. And so as a pastor, one of the things that I find is my responsibility, and I would encourage any of you pastors out there today to think about this, is that the Bible makes it clear parental responsibilities. I like to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Jesus refers to this passage. Paul refers to this passage. But this is where we are told, the nation of Israel is being told by Moses how to fear God and how to keep His commandments. And in verse 5 it says, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might." And he goes forward and he says, "You take these words that I'm giving you to this day, and they shall be in thy heart." And then he says, verse 7, "And thou shalt teach them." So you take them, you digest them, you understand God's commandments, and then you teach them to the next generation. And this applies to all of us, but especially to parents. He says, "And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and thou shalt talk of them everywhere you go," when you're in the house, and when you're walking along the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. There should be talking about the ways that God has taught us, about the things of God. And then he says you should put them around, you should bind them as a sign upon your hand, frontlets between your eyes, write them on the post of your house and on the gates, put them up everywhere. And Sam can show you, and Sam, you've talked a lot about this. Our founding fathers did that. You cannot go to an old building, an old government building in our nation, and not see these things put on the post and on the gates. And so, Sam, that's what I think pastors need to do. We need to remind people of their responsibility and remind people of Scripture.
And ladies and gentlemen, as you've watched the program today, we talk much about biblical worldview. You know, the scripture says there is a way that seemeth right unto a man. It's the world view of the world. Government as God. People do their own thing. It says, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. But there is a way that God lays out, His plan, His will, His way, His word. That when we do it, blessing comes, freedom results. It's always a matter of choice. I hope that you today, in this matter of your children, your grandchildren, claim what God says, a biblical world view. Educating your children, it's your responsibility. Don't give it away to anyone else. Train them up in the way they should go biblically, and when they are old, they will not depart from it.